welcome to our very first this.
Our very first this. We've never had a this before.
Not quite like this, no.
No, we're doing a discussion of Maiden's method, specifically some specific aspects of the Maiden's method. Jennifer took down some of her notes that she has all over the wall, like some kind of conspiracy theorist, you know?
You act as if I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
Well, that's true.
But yes, so what we have today is we're going to go over a couple different things. What we want to do is we want to address 1, the father, 2, the hero, 3, the fairy godmother. Now, that's actually, of course, those are going to spill over into each other a little bit, and we had an audience polled question that came in, so we'll just be addressing that one maybe near the end if we have some time. But so we'll go ahead and get right into it. Of course, this would be a little bit more snappy if it was just fathers and fairy godmothers. Yeah. But we want to talk about what are basically the Maiden's Method side characters. So whereas some of what would be considered the main characters as far as the Maiden's Method are concerned would be, of course, the Maiden herself, the main protagonist, the feminine threat being the main antagonist, and the manufactured companions being those side characters that are actually very integral to the Maiden's story. So we're going to consider them a little bit separate here. These are the elements that may or may not exist. They may be represented in some other forms. I mean, I think that's true of the Maiden's Method really in any sense.
True. These are archetypes. These aren't
literal.
I don't know. These aren't necessarily literal. It's like not every story has an actual dragon in it, but you will oftentimes find someone who fulfills the role of the dragon in some way, has the dragon-like characteristics.
And something I've found about even these characters that we're going to discuss today, which I think is really interesting, is that where the 10 steps of the Maiden's Method are going to be hit in one metaphorical sense or another, there may be no element of the father. There may not be any element of a fairy godmother. There may not be a hero. Sometimes these are the elements that we kind of tend to associate with the Maiden's Method that really aren't always there. But when they are, they play a big role. So I think it's worth discussing. So,
and they're common enough to where I would say they're in most stories that follow the Maiden's Method, if not all of them. Similarly to how in the hero's journey, not every single character who goes through the hero's journey has the refusal of the call. It's very common, and in fact, more often than not, they have a refusal of the call, but occasionally you find a story where they don't refuse the call. The second they get the call, they're off on the adventure.
Let's get going. Yeah, I think you find that more in the girls that are actually being the hero in their stories. But it's also one of those where each of these are going to tie in at one of the steps of the Maiden's Method. So we don't say that there has to be a father, but there does have to be an abandonment period. And usually it's the father that's the abandonment. There doesn't
sometimes the mother or something, but
right, but usually. So we're going with the max end of the parabola, right? So but for even again, there is always going to be a help is on its way stage, but it doesn't always manifest as the grandmother, as the grandmother. Wah, wah, Freudian slip there. The godmother,
or the hero,
but often when it does, there's a lot to be said for that. And I think even where you'll see that sometimes the manufactured companions tend to bleed into the help section, things like that. So, so let's get into it. We've got 3 lovely little cards for the father and a big old chunk for the fairy godmother. And I actually don't have any on the hero because most of where we've talked about that, I didn't even really think of incorporating. The hero has not been on my wall with all my other conspiratorial thinking. So there may be, who knows, this might actually be some pulling out some new note cards for me. So let's talk about the father as the abandoner. 3 different forms, basically, where he has to leave. on some sense of being called to duty, that can't actually care for them. Like, he can't care for his kids anymore, where he directly disowns them.
Yeah, sometimes that happens.
And then where it's rather unintentional or careless.
Yeah.
So
and oftentimes, the reason why he abandoned them is, he died. He didn't have much of a choice.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like, well, he didn't try to let you go. But there are some dads who do that, and that's worth addressing here, I think. So the examples that I have of each one, for those that have to leave, like there's some sort of call to duty, we have a lot of kids' stories that focus around the kids, their parents having to go off to war. Now, that is one of those where, of course, C.S. Lewis used that in a very period piece of bringing in the war.
Language in the wardrobe.
Yes, so the Pevensies have been abandoned by their father in the sense that he was called to duty. Sarah Crewe in A Little Princess was abandoned by her father because he had to go to the First World War.
Yeah, was that in both the book and the movie?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
So I thought it was a business trip in the book, and then in the movie version, the most recent movie version anyway, it was
brought him into the war.
Yeah, it was in World War I.
It might be, because being called to a duty seems a little bit better reason to leave your kid than going off for business.
Well, but a business trip is a form of duty as well.
Well, it
is
is
a duty to her care. And sometimes her care may require him to be elsewhere making money to pay for her food and lodging.
Right, and that's kind of where I think it's just one of those silly things that when storytellers are probably overthinking it. Because it's like, okay, where it may be more noble to leave your kid on that basis, because you absolutely had to. Frankly, leaving your kid for business every day is something that every parent has to do, and every child can far more associate with. Like,
you're abandoned to school.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Or the nanny or whatever.
A kid who's
grandma.
a kid whose dad dies in a car accident on his way to work is frankly not all that different from in a very wide archetypal sense, from the father who travels across distant lands for his business and falls ill on the road, and one just tends to be a little bit more romantic depending on how you tell the story, and that's the storyteller's job. You don't have to change the narrative for that.
It's like Ever After when her father leaves her. You'll notice he doesn't even get out of the gate before he has his heart attack.
I was just thinking the same thing, because the 2015 Cinderella does the same thing, where he leaves and he's out, but they've established that he comes and goes quite a bit. It's on his business trips where some of the other Cinderellas don't even address how he died.
Yeah, he did. I tell you, he did.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, there's just okay. So a little bit darker.
Okay.
Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah.
This idea of, I can't care for you anymore.
So I'm going to abandon you in the woods.
Secret Garden. What is her name? Mary.
Colin. Mary.
Colin actually is abandoned by his father because he's so unbelievably grief-stricken and basically has severe depression to the point where he has disassociated with his child and cannot care for him.
That's more or less how it works in the movie Powder as well. And you haven't seen... Oh, I need to show you Powder.
We'll have to make a list.
At the beginning of the movie, a pregnant woman is basically struck by lightning, or rather, I guess it hits the puddle that she's standing in, more or less. And she dies, but they manage to save the baby, but the baby is born with some abnormalities, albino white skin and no hair, and then later develops all kinds of weird powers because of the electricity or whatever. But pretty much the moment he's born, the father is so grief-stricken and then shocked by the sight of this child combining those together, and he just runs out of the hospital and never sees him again.
Wow.
It's And that is a very sad movie. I'll warn
no,
you,
yeah,
anyone
that doesn't sound
That's the way it starts, and,
like a heartwarmer.
and it doesn't get much happier. There are moments that are happier, but it's not a happy movie.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and it is. It's tragic, but that is a thing that happens and is worth telling stories about it.
Well, yeah, and I feel like even, especially today, a lot of people can relate to it because we have a lot of people who grew up in households without fathers. And that's not to say that those households are what's the word, defective because the father's missing, but, maybe it would have been better if the father had stuck around and been a father.
See, and that's always that's really what the question is like, I mean, assuming for the first set of the Maiden's Method to be abandoned to subpar care, the implication is that most likely, statistically, you're likely to have been better had your father been around.
Yeah.
Now, that's just something where, again, in the broad sense of it all, it's this abandonment to subpar care is like doesn't mean it ruined your childhood. It doesn't mean everything was awful and you were given no opportunities and blah, blah, those kinds of things are different. But I think that really what it comes down to is that you kind of know that there's this void. There is something missing. And for any one of these senses where the father is set as an abandoner, whether it's intentional or not, that same hole exists and doesn't go away. And I think it tends to be filled in kind of the same sorts of ways.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Hansel and Gretel, unfortunately, deals with a theme that a lot of these old fairy tales do, which is famine.
Yeah.
Now, I think that for us in America, that's not an easy concept to grasp. Yeah. But something that is rather prevalent, especially in these old German folk tales, and things where literally the grim fairy tale explanation for why the children are sent off into the woods is 2 mouths are easier to feed than 4.
Yeah.
Not an easy discussion to have. And, I mean, that's and that's when the father says, and I'm going to settle on 3 forget you women,
Yeah.
But, so the second one, okay, this is probably going to be a fun one to discuss, is disowning. The actual get out of my house abandonment. The first note I have on here is King Lear.
Yeah.
That one is hardcore. For I wish, of course, I can't quote Shakespeare. I need to grab it off the shelf over there. But for the lines that she says, like, basically, it's if I were to, I couldn't say anything that would honor you in the way that my love and my devotion for you could. And he wants lip service. And because he gets it from his other 2 daughters and not from Cordelia, is that her name?
I think so.
Okay, I know. And because he doesn't get it from her, he literally is, okay, do you want her? Because I don't want her. Is this marriage proposal that he's thrusting her into. Yeah. And it is cold-blooded.
Yeah, and it's... when you have a father who disowns their children, oftentimes it seems to be this thing of they expected certain things of their children. They expected their children to be certain people, and then when they turned out to not be those people, they disown them. They say, well, this isn't my kid anymore. Which is really screwed up considering to what degree nurture really has an effect on how we turn out to be who we are. It's like there's some degree of just nature itself that sometimes people are just ruled by whatever their genetics have put into their instincts or whatever. And sometimes also nurture doesn't just mean what your parents did, but also the rest of the society around you, the influence of your friends, the influence of other family members, the influence of teachers, right. Or in Shakespeare's times, tutors and servants and so on. But it's like, Mr. Lear, you have had more influence on how this person turned out than anybody else. You have no right to say, not my daughter anymore. Especially over something as ridiculous as a lack of lip service.
Right.
But you do see things like that in real life where parents will disown their children because they didn't follow the rules. I mean, and there were, yeah.
Well, and it is. There is an interesting archetype in that, I think, especially speaking toward the Maiden method, where, and I mean, again, my knowledge of King Lear is limited, but yeah, I think that tends to be more or less the falling from grace that he experiences is that his whole empire, I mean, he has 3 daughters and he's a king. That in itself has set him. So basically, he wants that assurance. He wants to know. But for what eventually befalls him is kind of like you were saying, that you have had influence on making her a good person. So when she does something that defies you in her goodness, you're gonna call that not worthy. You're gonna call, or just your hand in this empire which you have built, and the inevitability of when you actually start to act upon it, it falls apart.
Yeah.
That's where you could do a whole spin-off, like talking about Dad's story, right? There's a lot of that.
And then there's many kinds of disownment. I would argue that in The Little Mermaid, in the scene where Triton blows up Ariel's
grotto
collection in her grotto, that's a form of disownment, because he's not saying you're not my daughter anymore, but he's saying what you have decided to be is not my daughter. And this is part of the identity that she has chosen to cultivate for herself, and he's decided, no, this cannot be a part of you. As long as you live under my ocean, you will obey my rules. And it's part of what makes that scene
which
so
is
cruel.
Funny, but she's never not going to be under his ocean. That's
unless she becomes human.
And
yes,
exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing is, to say, as long as you're under my roof, young lady, that's one thing. But when your dad is God, are you going to always follow the rules, or does Dad have to understand that your nature is going to be a bit flawed, and you maybe need to go out and be able to see the danger of the human world? And I don't know.
He needs to show grace.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Which he learns at the end, and
right. Even though she doesn't learn much at the end, but
yeah, he learns more than she does. Yeah, but
which is maybe something interesting to take note of for those fathers who stick around through the whole story.
Yeah, that oftentimes they're the ones who really learn something. I would say Maurice in Beauty and the Beast. He learns to trust his daughter's judgment. When she wants to take his place in the Disney version specifically, he tells her, "No, Belle, listen to me. I'm old. I've lived my life." And the Beast, just drags him away and throws him out. And he comes up with this whole plan to go and save her. And ultimately, it's his whole plan and everything else that really leads to the angry mob wanting to go and kill the Beast. Mm-hmm. When really, had he really listened to Belle, I mean, even when she says, "He's different now, Papa. He's kind and gentle." That horrible Beast! Even then, he's not ready to accept that she knows what she's talking about. And we don't really see that change per se, except in so much as we do see him in the palace at the end standing next to Mrs. Potts. And just smiling as Belle and Adam, I guess, Prince Adam, are dancing together.
Yeah,
that's what I hear.
I know, it never sounds
Prince
quite
Beast.
right. I know, exactly. Well, and so there are a few things where, okay, so it is intentional. He has to disown her, but it is 100% for her good.
I'm not sure I know of any examples where he has to disown her and it's for her own good.
Oh, I would say the Sleeping Beauty. Has to send her away.
You're right. Sending her away to stay with the fairies in the woods.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. You have Elora Danan.
Oh yes.
And
that's her mother.
Her mother has to let her go, but yes, that's absolutely for her
good. And the midwife even has to stay behind, and Elora Danan gets abandoned twice. First by her mother, and then by the midwife who stays and fights the weird mutant dogs, so that Elora Danan can get away in the little basket floating down the river, all Moses style.
No, little Moses. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
And she gets found by the little village of Nelwynds, they're called.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Now, okay, so let's talk about some of the unintentional and careless fathers. Dying is one thing, that's the obvious one.
Yeah, can't really control that most of the time.
Mr. Banks.
Mr. Banks is an interesting one because he does kind of abandon them for the sake of the cares of the world.
Yeah.
Now, in his mind, I'm sure that it's the idea of he's also caring for them. Mm-hmm. He's working in a bank. He's making
doing
money.
His best,
he's providing them this amazing home. Right. He's paying for a nanny. He's paying for a cook. He's paying for a maid. And all the while, I can't tell if he actually knows that his wife is doing the suffragette thing, but he's affording her free time to do that. By paying for all these things.
She changes the flower in his lapel, right?
I think she does, yeah.
Okay, I was about to. I couldn't remember if she changed it in her own, like if she was hiding it, but I think she just goes and changes the flower out of his lapel. But I think that's a little wink at the suffragettes. But yes, there is something in what his distraction has essentially robbed from the family. And it's sometimes he just can't see past the end of his nose.
Yeah, he doesn't understand that it's those small things. It's those little acts of kindness, like giving a little money mending the kite, giving a little money to the poor old woman, right. And then feeding birds with the crumbs that she's gathered. And the sad part about that one is that when he's on his way to the bank, he stops at the steps of the church where the old lady is, and she's not there. He missed his chance to be kind to her. And I think that there's kind of a silent lesson in that. You missed your chance to be kind to this old lady. Don't miss your chance to be kind to your children.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And he doesn't miss that
chance.
Yeah,
you're going to get this cats in the cradle moment. And yeah absolutely. So, and the thing is, for any one of these abandonment things that come into play, the trouble of it is that sometimes it is without intention of the father that the one who is abandoned is going to perceive this in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And that's where if you want to focus in on the character of the father, you can really go into the backstory and give him an explanation, give him why and motivation and things like that. If you don't, just kill him off. That's fine. Except, okay, so let's talk about Mia Thermopolis in Princess Diaries. Her dad both willfully abandons her and dies.
Yeah, that's true.
So for his abandonment toward her, one, to take up the calling of his birthright, to take the throne, understand that by taking that role and the life that his wife wants for herself was one of those where he felt the higher calling in his duty, and that meant her mom really plays quite a bit of a role in that too, and something to be said, like, really, just because you didn't want to be living a royal life, like, although we've seen that play out now in real life, that there are certain expectations of royals that if the whole family is not willing to play along, then you see
that with the British royal family
exactly
these days.
There are some different then either you take the job fully or you don't. And so when you have this kid in the mix, maybe all the better that the royal family, that they're making those decisions without the little ones yet. But it's like, and not splitting up families for the sake of it, that's really where it comes down in this narrative of Princess Diaries, that for him, even her friend says, well, he did, what is it? I can't remember the exact line, but they basically imply that he's just sent her a card on her birthday every year. And that's kind of the extent of his contact with her, which is a little bit like, really? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You could, I understand where that story was going, but you could do a retelling of that narrative, which really plays into the psychology a little bit more deeply, because there are some hardcore themes playing through that. And I think that those certain levels where if she were to address that, and whereas some other characters do, of why did they leave me? Was I not good enough? Why couldn't you have just stayed? Why couldn't you have contacted me more? Why? Seeking that, basically that knowledge, that abandonment to subpar care, that the above par care, the par care that I could have had with my dad.
And in a more comedic example, granted, but it's still a very powerful moment, we get a situation where the, quote, maiden, at least the person going through the maiden's method, gets to ask the father figure why, point blank. And that's in How I Met Your Mother, when we have the scene where Barney's at his real dad's house, and he's trying to take down the basketball hoop, and it's clear he has no idea how to use tools. And his dad says, "Barney, do you want to talk?" "Why would I want to talk to you? You're just some lame suburban dad." And his dad asks him, "Why does that bother you so much?" "Because if you were going to be some lame suburban dad, then why couldn't you have been my lame suburban dad?" Mm-hmm. And we never get a good answer. Mm-hmm. Because there isn't one. Right. Really. John Lithgow's character, Barney's father, he screwed up. Mm-hmm. And he adapted to what he needed to be far too late.
And he says to him, he said, "Well, what can I do? Tell me, what can I do? You can help me take this net down." Yeah. And so he does. He helps him, use the tools. And
tells him how to do it.
Tells him, works through this moment where he ends up taking the basketball hoop in this very childish, defiant act and goes and gives it to Ted, But it's like, that confrontation needed to happen, because while there is no good answer, it's a good question. Yeah. And sometimes you just need to get it out of there. Mm-hmm. So, something about the maiden that I have a note here for. Her father is the first man to love her. And by loving her poorly, he sets a dangerous precedent. Every child must learn that they are not the center of the universe. They are not the most precious thing. They are not the highest priority of all. If only they could learn such things when they are no longer vulnerable children. Yeah. So the truth of the matter is, when the kid comes into the world, they are center of focus. Lots of marriages need to be told it's okay to spend time with your spouse and not your child. A lot of kids need to be told, mommy and daddy can't be with you right now. This idea that when you are the focus and the center of attention, there's a time when that's okay, and there's a time when that definitely needs to be weaned. Yeah. The problem of the Maiden's method is that we tend to encounter those at a situation where it's very jarring. To understand that for those who have, again, going back to like the King Lear example of one who has deliberately disowned his child, is where her devotion to him might be saying, "Dad, you're the center of my world," and she's finding that, "Child, you are not the center of mine. In fact, I don't want you in it." So, it's probably worth saying, you and I can have this discussion, so hello world. The frustration that I have of this weird thing these days where adult male affection towards children is seen as creepy.
Yeah. And if you need a very good example of this, take a look at Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Daryl has a song about his affection for his daughter, and how the whole time he has to say, but it's not in a creepy way. And, I mean, it's possible.
The song pushes it.
Yeah.
That is creepy, but...
Yeah, it does, but at the same time, I kind of wonder to what degree maybe the song, maybe that's the point of the song, is to point out that this is what fathers are kind of being subjected to, is this idea that if you're affectionate with your children, the wrong assumptions are made.
Right.
And
it's
very dangerous.
It is, and somehow I've not by anyone I know, but I've heard people scoff at a daddy-daughter dance, and it's kind of no, you need to understand that we have lost something in our society by not allowing little girls to look beautiful, dance, show off her talent and beauty and everything she is to a man that has no intention of exploiting her sexually for it.
Yeah. Just to have that idea is actually a very beautiful thing, and it's also it's a problem really for a lot of children who just want to be affectionate and don't understand why dad's kind of pulling back a little bit for the sake of appearances. I mean, to use a little bit of an example from my own life, there's our nephew. One time he was 2, and whenever he said goodbye to somebody, he would be with a kiss, someone he knew. And so one time he was over at our place, and I had some friends coming over, and he goes to say goodbye, and he goes for a kiss. So I turned my cheek toward him, but he never kissed anybody on the cheek. No. So he grabs my face, turns me to face him, kisses me on the lips, and I just...
Both hands on your cheeks?
Yes, yeah. Both hands holding my face in place, and kisses me on the lips, and I just burst out laughing, and he looked at me like I was from space. What's wrong with you?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, what's wrong with me? You're right, kid. It's a 2-year-old who wants a kiss because, he's 2. He wants affection. Okay, that shouldn't be weird. But because of our society, and because the guys were over, granted there was that, and it ended up feeling kind of weird, and and I laughed about it.
Yeah, yeah. The thing is, there are boundaries. There is an age at which that goes away, and there is
if he did that now, it'd be seriously,
even at 6 years old, it's this, honey, this is not how men are going to interact. No. We're going to teach him that a little bit more. But that's the thing, is even then a 7-year-old girl doesn't have to be kissing daddy on the lips, but I don't really see anything wrong with it at the same time. You can set up those boundaries on an individual basis, but you have to understand that the pervasiveness of these ideas in our society, I think, means something a little bit more deeply when there is this representation of just give her that one guy. This is why women like to have the guy friend. This is where the friend zone comes from, because women desperately need a man that doesn't need anything from her.
Yeah. Yeah.
That can just give, that can just be there, that can just be a comforter, can be an ear to listen. That should be dad.
Yeah. Should be. Or at least a brother,
Yeah.
I mean, and even brothers sometimes will fall away from that because they also have the image that they got to uphold.
And it is. There's a tenderness level to that where that men never grasp until you're really around kids, it's one of those where because it is kind of trained out of you at a young age, honey, this is how men are going to behave, that tempers that a little bit, and that's fine. But the interaction between the sexes needs to have a sort of comfort on the stance of there's nothing more than just this special intimacy that we share. That dad-daughter relationship is so unique. And without it, we have a lot of broken girls in this world.
Yeah. Well, and then you see the same sort of thing oftentimes in the hero's journey. Dad in the hero's journey is usually missing in some capacity. He's distant. It's hard to figure out. It's hard to get a hold of his affection because he's somewhere else. And sometimes that's because he's in the belly of the whale, so to speak, or in the underworld in some fashion. And it's the hero's job to go and rescue him, and sometimes it's because he's the bad guy, which is a different kind of being in the underworld, and usually the hero has to go and rescue him, or in some cases has to overpower him to prove that he's not going to be the same kind of man that his father turned out to be. Which is a much harsher way for the hero's journey to go. But yeah, it's the same sort of thing,
absolutely.
Really.
Yeah.
Dad is distant, and it's hard to get his affections more often than not.
So let's talk about dad that sticks around, that maybe has a redemptive arc, learns something in the end, and basically that dad becomes the savior. It doesn't happen a lot, but I have a couple examples here. One, Jasmine.
Oh yes, the Sultan
changes the
father.
law.
Yeah. Of course, I'm Sultan.
Oh,
duh.
Let's do that, because it is really that is and always will be the conflict of the royal lineage of you have to marry a prince. It's like, do you have to marry a prince? Like, can we not make an exception once in a while? Like, it's a good question. So, Hansel and Gretel, technically. Dad comes back. Dad takes them home. They don't actually get eaten. They do their own escaping, but and it doesn't actually. Like the Grimm fairy tale never says anything about the stepmom. It's just like, and she was dead. Like, oh, good. She is no longer a problem.
I tell you, she did.
She did. So
It was like, did Dad kill her?
I
hope not.
That's a good question.
But considering how dark that story is, or maybe she was actually the witch. See, because I don't know.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh.
See, so maybe the kids killed her.
Feminine threat. That's right. Maybe the kids killed her. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't underestimate the change of heart. Maiden externally threatened by the order of man. So the question of the order of man being the masculinity of order and versus the femininity of chaos. So now the change of heart, of course, is a big thing. Like, Dad might just change his mind. Like, that is something that women definitely have to, especially in a sense of feminine chaos. If that's basically where you are and where you're operating for a little while, the other side of where you're eventually going to find yourself conflicting is in the sense of, nope, this is the way it's always been. That's Dad. That's the archetypal father. That's the order of the way, that's the law. That's something that always comes in. But Dad has to have a little grace and has to work in something within the law that allows for the girl to come home.
Yeah. Or to be free to live her own life. Either one. Really.
Yeah.
And again, using Hansel and Gretel and Jasmine and her father on one side, but also Ariel and Triton on the other.
Exactly.
Freeing her to live her own life.
And that's the thing, is you would like to believe that freeing her to live her own life would allow her would make her want to still spend it with you. Yeah. That's the real question, is like, does Triton never get to see her again? Like, I didn't see the sequels either. That's a good question. But let's just leave it as the standalone tale, is that does leaving home really mean leaving home? Or is it something where can we not compromise and still have this family? Because isn't that the point? That, an overprotective father doesn't want her to get hurt or go off and never see her again. If you die, I never get to see you again. If you get married and I never get to see you again, what's the difference? That overprotection is something that I can totally understand the motivation behind that. So
in the case of Triton, though, I mean, if he can give her legs, he can give himself legs. Like, hey, come over to visit,
Something to think about.
Probably.
That's a good
But I don't know. That's probably overthinking specifically that example.
That's right.
And the movie version in particular.
Yeah. Well, so that we're not sitting here for 2 hours, that's 3 cards on the father, and we've got a big old chunk on the fairy godmother. Yeah. So let's
Incidentally, I saw earlier when you were pulling the cards down, you were asking why a fairy and why a godmother.
Yes.
Well, I would say why a fairy is relatively easy to answer, and that comes down to the idea of sort of where fairies come from, really. Fairies, as we know them today, come from Celtic mythology originally. They weren't always the little things with the wings. That was a Victorian era construct, but most of the time they more or less looked human, but maybe would have some kind of odd feature about them in some way. Usually tall, beautiful, slender, something like that. But they usually came from sort of an other world of sorts, and that other world was also the world of dreams.
Okay, sure.
So when you consider that one of the types of manufactured companions is a dream, it also ties it in that way. The fairy is a dream type manufactured companion. As the fairy godmother in Cinderella says, if you'd lost all your faith, I couldn't be here, but here I am. There's also the aspect of magic. Of course, fairies are associated with magic, but moreover the idea that fairies are sometimes a stand-in for angels or gods or some kind of divine presence as well. When Christianity came to the British Islands, a lot of people who still believed in fairies tried to reconcile their beliefs in fairies with the Christian beliefs, and
sort of associated.
It's a type of angel, or it's a type of saint, and that sort of thing. So it's also the idea of divine intervention, which also ties it into the fact that it's fairy, god, and mother.
Right.
It's 3 things in one, but it's also the 2 things primarily. Now, as for a godmother, the purpose of godparents is to ensure that if the child loses their parents, that they still have someone who's looking out for their well-being.
And now, presumably going to raise them as a Christian.
Yeah, usually something along those lines, but otherwise to make sure that they're taken care of. And sometimes it's not actually, I'm going to adopt them if you die. Sometimes it's, okay, well, they may go to your next of kin, but I'm going to be watching. Right. And we see this in the 1950s Roger and Hammerstein's Cinderella with her godmother, who she doesn't call a fairy godmother in the movie, even though that's clearly what she is. But she comes around, oh, godmother, and her godmother asks her, oh, why aren't you going to the ball? And there's that moment that you point out that she doesn't say that it's because her stepmother told her she can't.
She catches herself. She's like, well, my stepmother. Oh, well, what does she say?
Someone has to watch the house.
Someone has to watch the house. So you're like, oh, okay. But so she doesn't decry what her.
Yeah. So the godmother's job, to some degree, is to make sure that she's being taken care of. And the godmother in that seems like she's not exactly doing the best job, but to a certain degree, I suppose we can't really blame her if Cinderella is constantly covering for her stepmother.
Exactly. She seems to be kind of giving her lie.
Yeah, and that's something that you see very common with young people in abusive households. They cover for their abusers more often than not. So, it's not really that bad. No, it's not really their fault.
It's interesting, though, because that is something that you see often with the godmother, grandmother sort of figure archetype. Makes me think of Moana, in the sense that they allow them to persist in their lies. Because it's kind of like the godmother seems to know, honey, if I were to tell you the truth, you wouldn't listen to me. If you were to tell you the truth, you would listen.
Yeah. Well, and that's very common also of people who are in abusive homes, whether it's an abusive relationship or abusive parental figures or whatever. If you straight up tell them, hey, you're in a situation where you're being abused, no. I mean, yeah, this weird thing happens now and then, but that's not really who they are. That's not really how it is. And they'll make excuses, and it's very sad when it happens. And in that way, you can't really just come out and say it. I had a friend actually who was in a relationship with a woman who was definitely abusing him, and I was stuck in an odd position where I couldn't really straight up tell him, hey, this is a problem, but I would sometimes, I don't know, find little ways to drop the slightest hints, and it was less of, hey, this is a bad situation, and more of, in a good relationship, this, focusing on what's the ideal so that he would stop and make the comparison. And one time he finally calls me and he says, look, I've been reevaluating this relationship and I'm not sure what to do. And I said, okay, well, let me ask you this. If you were to receive this call from a young lady who was asking you what she should do about a relationship in which a man was treating her the way this woman's treating you, what would you do? What would you say to her? And he says, run for the hills. I said, then you already have your answer, and that's your answer. He knew.
See, and that's the thing. Showing them the ideal.
Yes.
That is
very important.
100% fairy, angelic godmother.
Yeah.
The idea is that I can't make you realize anything, but I can help you understand in the way that you have become accustomed to understanding things, which is through your own mind and your own setting up a mirror, that basically there is something beyond this for you.
Yeah.
And that there is something better that you can move toward and aspire to. And that is very much the godmother role throughout this thing. So
yeah, that's interestingly, I just realized that's the role of Don Quixote to Dulcinea in The Man of La Mancha. He's her fairy godfather, so to speak, because he's talking about loving her pure and chaste from afar, and talking to her as if she's a fair maiden and a noble lady and all these things.
Right.
Because
she never otherwise would have even thought that was an option. Like she doesn't believe him for a while. She refuses to believe him after a little while. Yeah. Because that possibility has just never been presented before.
Yeah.
So, there are a couple things that I think we can address really quickly with that. There is an ethereal knowledge to the fairy godmother. And I think that basically, like, when we talk about being stuck in the blackening, stuck in the whitening, stuck in the yellowing, there is no such thing as getting stuck in the reddening. Because the reddening inherently is multiplication. So if you're going to get stuck there, it means you're just creating more and more and more. So if you were to basically, I don't think it's the same thing as quite getting stuck in the reddening phase, but it is that it's kind of like as soon as you reach the reddening, there is every opportunity for a secondary abandonment. And that if you go through the Maiden's Method cycle enough times, you're basically going to become a fairy godmother.
Yeah, where they're basically in this totally new phase, which is the blue. Because
right.
the fairy godmother is so often represented by the color blue. I mean, just to cite movie examples, of course, you see it in the fairy godmother in Cinderella. You see it with
the blue fairy in Pinocchio.
The blue fairy in Pinocchio. One of the three fairies in Sleeping Beauty, which, if I remember right, isn't the blue fairy even specifically the one who makes it so that instead of dying when she pierces her finger, she's going to just sleep?
Yep.
So, yeah, it's the blue one who acts as the fairy godmother in that sense and prevents her from dying. Then, even in Catholicism, it's the color associated with the Virgin Mary. And it's a in
Sacre bleu.
yeah, and then in Judaism, the Levitical priesthood wears blue robes. It's associated with the divine in that way, the highest ideal.
Yeah, there's that kind of royal blue. There's a sense of like in the trueness of her royalty, and I think there's actually something to be said for like in the aesthetic, and we see this mostly in Disney movies. But her dress is often blue. When she's you see that with Belle, you see that with Cinderella in various installments. When people are trying to fight the aesthetic, you see that go away. When people are just subconsciously putting things together, it's absolutely there.
Yeah.
So something to be thought of in that. So if creation is the goal, then basically the fairy godmother is essentially just going to become the one to help facilitate that. So, for the elders' wisdom, it's kind of like they do know something that's unknown. There is a sort of esoteric knowledge. And you kind of have to ask yourself why, because there are a couple different theories of interpretation of how you could gain that. On the one hand, it is like that cyclical nature. It's the Groundhog Day logic. Well, maybe he's not omnipotent. Maybe he's just been around so long he knows everything.
Yeah.
So,
they've gone through life enough times.
Eternal life with a good memory could make you seem like God.
That's Merlin. From the story of
totally.
Arthur, he's gone through life backwards,
right,
and thus remembers the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is it doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is that you listen. It doesn't matter where their knowledge came from. Are they right? That is a good lesson that most people need to learn from, especially today. I think that is a modern thing that more stories need to... It's kind of like... And I don't love this. I think it's actually kind of... I think it's a cop-out. But to say, why should I listen to you? Why should I? Because I said so. It's really... The root of that is that you would hope as a parent that you have enough authority with your child for that to be a good explanation. Yeah. Because there are plenty of people where it's because I said so. Well, who are you?
Yeah.
What that and what?
Yeah. And in order to use the because I said so, you need to have proven yourself to have knowledge and wisdom enough times to where that holds some weight. Because I said so. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes that is used, honestly, when the real answer is too complicated for the other person to understand. Mm-hmm. And I mean,
you might just have to trust me.
If you try to give an hour-long explanation about what's going on to a child, they're going to tune out within 10 seconds anyway. And even if they do stop and listen, the chances of them comprehending it, very much depends on their age, their maturity, that particular child's level of grasping things.
It's all through. And let's face it is a cop-out. Sometimes you just need to cop out. Yeah. It's okay, but at the same time, you need to understand that there is something where that breakdown for the kid, for the other person, for this, you have to be able to emphasize it by saying, because I said so, not because I said so.
Oh, yeah.
It can't be the words, it can't be the command. Sometimes it has to be the person. Now, the other side of that is sometimes it can't be the person and it has to just be the words. That's where each individual has to, frankly, have that sort of discernment for themselves. But if you heard someone spouting the truth, and you know it to be true, regardless of who that person is, it doesn't make it any less true.
Yeah.
You may not respect them, and you may even be shocked that they're saying truth. Because they may not be a truthful person, they may not uphold that all day long, but all told, sometimes we need to be willing to know that we would like to believe that it is someone with our best interest at heart, that it is the Godmother that is speaking to us with truth.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just the fairy, and they're still mischievous, and they're still a pixie, and they don't care about us, and they don't have our best interests at heart, but they do have a knowledge beyond time that we need to incorporate into our own lives.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
That's true.
So that's the fun of storytelling.
Sometimes even the feminine thread is the one spouting truth, and it's a cruel truth.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the most dangerous feminine threats are the ones spouting truth.
So that actually, I have that on my next card. The feminine threat shares knowledge with ulterior motives, but the fairy godmother shares it when it will be best used. So basically, a feminine threat is very willing to let you know what truth is at a time when it's most advantageous for her. Mm-hmm. The fairy godmother will do it when it's most advantageous for the maiden.
Yes, and that's a very important distinction. Is that, I mean, we see a little bit of that with Mother Gothel, and she has her song when she's telling Rapunzel all about what's dangerous out there. You know, poison ivy, quicksand, the plague, men with pointy teeth. You know,
yeah.
None of that stuff is false. She's playing it up like it's worse than it really is, sure. But all that stuff is out there.
Yeah.
And in fact, you know, Rapunzel encounters a couple of men who are pretty dangerous. And some of them have pointy teeth.
Yeah.
In the I have a dream, you know, scenario. You know, a couple of those men I'm pretty sure have pointy teeth.
Yeah.
You know, and one's got a hook for a hand and, you know, everything else. I don't think she encounters poison ivy or quicksand or the plague, you know, or anything like that.
As far as we know.
As far as we know, I don't know. There is a Rapunzel show, or that is the Tangled show. Maybe she encounters all of those things.
Takes a dark turn and she hits the plague years.
Yeah. Jeez. I don't know. Maybe. I haven't seen it.
You never know.
Yeah.
Fill us in if you've seen Tangled the series.
Yeah.
Well, and it is. There's something that... It's kind of like... The fairy godmother might actually retain knowledge even when we, the audience, are sitting here like, why couldn't you have just shared that with her sooner? Why did you not just give Dorothy the shoes?
Yeah. Or rather, because Dorothy had the shoes, why not tell her what she can do with them?
Why not tell her that she can go home?
Yeah, at any time she wants. Because she wouldn't have believed me, you know. And yeah, it's true.
It is true.
But it is true.
You can't tell a runaway there's no place like home. You have to show them a world so dark and scary that the fact of the matter is, no matter whether you're running away from the witches at home that want to take your dog away from you, or the witches here who want to take your shoes away from you, that there are witches in this world and you are never ever going to be able to do anything unless you have brains, courage, and heart enough to stop them.
Yeah.
And once you can learn that, you may need to go out into the world, honey. Fairy godmother might just need to say, well, okay, go walk that road.
Yeah.
It's only paved with gold. Go ahead. And it's winding and it's going to take you somewhere you wouldn't expect. And when they pull the curtain back on you, everything is going to fall apart. And you're going to understand that that even with the wizard's help, it's nothing. It's all just inside you. You had the power to go home all along. But you didn't have the belief. You didn't have the understanding. You didn't have the wisdom. You didn't have the knowledge. You didn't have the ability.
Yeah.
So for that knowledge to be retained until the time at which it's actually going to be used and most advantageous, that's the fairy godmother's job. That's wisdom.
Yeah.
So... Yeah. I have a subnote here that says, the hag uses knowledge to be a better hunter. The Snow Queen compares to her mirror self and determines to override it. The dragon controls knowledge and how it's used. and the fairy godmother uses it to promote others. So the way that they're using their wisdom and their abilities are going to be based on their motivations. That for the fairy godmother is willing to release her control over that knowledge and give that over to the girls. So
yeah.
I have a note here called conditional help. Faith required, withheld for some time for some reason. So we know that kind of goes back into what we were talking about just then with that Dorothy needing to be able to truly believe. If you had lost all your faith, I couldn't be here.
And Cinderella, yeah.
Right. For Moana, I love Moana because she has such a really awesome, for many reasons I love Moana, but her grandmother plays such an interesting role in her knowing thyself moment that Moana hands the heart of the ocean back to the ocean.
And the heart of Tafiti back to the ocean. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, the heart of the ocean's different, isn't it?
That's from Titanic.
That's Titanic, yes. So when she hands the heart of Tafiti, like, please, she's begging the ocean, and the ocean comes and grabs and slowly takes it from her. Mm-hmm. This is a very voluntarily laying down and giving up everything that she doesn't think that she can be accomplishing anymore. Like, she had this calling that she doesn't feel like she can answer. And her grandmother just takes her in her arms and doesn't tell her anything new.
Yeah.
And just says, honey, you have come so far. You've done well. Do you want to go home? It's just, and she starts to put that paddle in the water and stops. And it's, yeah. I don't know. I'm a wayfarer and I don't know where to go.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, you do. You know your past, you know your future, and here we are in the present. How are you going to bring those two together?
Yeah.
You're both. You are Moana. You are the ocean. You are everything. That's all of that is just giving her that opportunity of, do you know who you are?
Yeah.
Her grandmother doesn't offer her anything in that moment but an opportunity to be and know who she is. That there's this sense of confrontation with the reflective mirrors all over the place and everything.
Well, and the thing that her grandmother does give her, though, is that when she's in the midst of her turmoil and her freaking out over this whole thing, her mother offers her understanding and gentleness and compassion. Later on, when Moana realizes that what Taka is, what does she do? She offers her understanding and gentleness and compassion because she realizes that that's what makes you realize who you are.
Let her come to me.
Yeah. And she says, this is not who you are. You know who you are. To bring Taka back to being Tafiti.
Absolutely.
Because her grandmother already showed her the way to do that. So she becomes the fairy godmother to a goddess, which is very powerful. That's the same sort of that's the same sort of journey that what's his name, Maui, went on to start out human and become a demigod. To get to a point where you can offer something to deities.
Right. See, and that is there's something to be said for the fact that the value of humanity is potential. There is this sort of unique ability for us to commune with a higher power, to be able to take some sort of knowledge beyond us and to give it to a world and creatures and beings that otherwise couldn't attain it. There's this sort of like Promethean ability to that when man had fire, everything changed. That because through fire, yes, we could destroy, but yes, we could also create, and that wisdom of being able to know and to be able to use this knowledge that is unique to human beings, that sort of thing, the soul, the power, all of that are these themes that are encompassed in something where if you start to believe that your base nature is your real nature, you never get to that point. There's a reason that the blackening stage is very animalistic and that the yellowing stage is very much about knowledge.
Yeah.
Because you go through this progression of working through base instincts into knowledge of self and reality, and then kind of the higher than reality knowledge how to, this every time you transcend into one higher dimension before the other one is when you then gain the ability to put your finger back through all the rest of them, but you can't reverse that, and so it's kind of like you have to be arranged. There is a sort of progression and a semblance of all the ingredients are there. That's kind of the thing about the Maiden's method, right? That there's always kind of these, it's that alchemical thought. The base materials are and always will be there. But can you take those base elements and combine them and percolate them and use time and measurement and chemistry to work those base materials into something greater? Yeah. So the knowledge and the wisdom that the fairy godmother brings has a lot to do with time, has a lot to do with apportionment, has a lot to do with just how she measures out and is willing to give that knowledge to others. You have it's worth discussing why the mother is not the godmother.
Well, there's actually one instance that I can think of where the mother is the godmother, and that is one particular version of Cinderella that I read years ago, and it's implied more so than outright stated. But Cinderella's mother was buried in a certain spot, and then a tree grew from that spot, and then there's a dove in the tree that has a nest, and every now and then an egg will fall out of the nest, and when it hits the ground, it becomes something that Cinderella needs. So it's implied in that case that her mother is the fairy godmother. But that is the only case that I can think of where the mother is the fairy godmother. And that's interesting because I think that part of the reason for that is that the differing levels of where the instincts lie. Sometimes the fairy godmother is a grandmother. We do see that specifically in Princess Diaries. We see that's one example. But that's different from the mother because the mother's instincts are she's a little too close to the situation, so to speak. There needs to be that distance in order to have the bird's eye view needed to realize that the basic problem, because the mother understands the vast intricacies of her daughter's problems if she's there. Whereas a godmother, a grandmother, Leonardo da Vinci,
exactly.
They have a more distant view of it and therefore can see it more clearly, and break it down to its basic level. And granted, Leonardo da Vinci wasn't entirely right in his assessment, But he was right in his assessment of what should have happened after he sent her to the ball with wings, you know, so that the fish could be with the bird.
Right, right.
You know?
Yeah. He got her ready for the ball, but the ball didn't offer her everything, you know, and that's... The more I've been thinking about the Cinderella story, the more I think that's really the idea of midnight. That the fairy godmother can get you to the ball. Can you dance? Can you have the social graces that you need? Can you perform and be who you are and who you need to be? And can you understand that these things only come for a time? And can you come home at the end of the day and return to the fact that the fairy tale doesn't last forever? Can you voluntarily walk away from the ball?
Yeah.
That's something that no Cinderella story addresses. How hard is it for this poor girl who has been given the world, even has this man here who would gladly marry her on the spot if he had the wherewithal to think about it. He's so bewitched by her, he doesn't even think to pop the question in the moment.
Yeah.
Before she's running off and he doesn't have a chance. Yes, everything could fall away. Yes, there is this sort of sense of like being discovered. Yeah, there's that kind of problem. But are you able to walk into the dream for a time and walk right back out of it into hell again?
Yeah. That's pretty heavy.
It is. And, you know, thank you for everything.
Yeah.
Ugh! Stab you in the heart a little bit more.
Yeah.
When
Knowing that she's got to go back and face her stepmother and stepsister.
And she's so willing. She was so ready to just let the ball be what it was and just take the memory and it'll kill you.
And that's that lesson that, you know, oftentimes if you're grateful for what you have,
more will come.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Ugh. Well, and so, okay, we've just got a couple cards left here. We'll go ahead and wrap it up in the next 15 minutes.
We should probably still talk about the hero, too, once we're done talking about the fairy godmother.
Do we want to make this a two-parter? Do we want to do an hour and 15, or do we want to try and push this through for 2 hours?
I don't think a full 2 hours. I don't think there's too much to discuss about the hero just yet.
You don't think so? Okay, all right.
We may end up with a...
I was about to say, you and I think we could do that more easily than we could cut it under that amount of time. But let's do what we can. So just finishing up the fairy godmother, I think the maiden, until now, has in her encounters with other women, has always been, I shouldn't say always, many other women along her story have been rather combative and difficult. And she's encountered women who only want to take from her, whereas a mother should give. I think that's why it's often a stepmother.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like...
Stepmother is the not mother.
Yeah, you get a horror story when it's mom.
Yeah.
That's when you get Mommy Dearest. That's when you get... Psycho and Carrie. Those where mom sticks around and is still just as horrifying a creature, if not more so, than the actual, like, to have...
It's a much deeper betrayal.
Yeah, it's a darker story to tell, and I think that there's a sort of detachment by using a stepmother in that way. So there's something where the hag has a mother feeds her child, a hag feeds off her child. A mother prepares her child for the real world. The Snow Queen perpetuates lies. A real mother releases her child to the world, whereas a dragon surrounds her and won't let her be part of the real world. Any one of those maternal things that should otherwise be given to a child, to the maiden, to these girls, is being stolen through the different sort of hag and snow queen dragon archetypes that we see.
Yeah.
So for the fairy godmother to give with a certain extra sense of wisdom and ethereal knowledge, and that kind of pushes where I think what I've come to find is when you actually have mom, she's probably going through her own Maiden's method.
Yeah.
I meant to say going through her own method, and then I said Maiden.
Yeah, and I can't think of necessarily an example of that off the top of my head of it actually being mom, but a very mom-like figure we have in the story of Matilda with Miss Honey. Miss Honey is very much a mother figure, and she is going through a Maiden's method at the same time. And both of them are the fairy godmother for each other, which is part of what makes that story just very fascinating, very interesting, very beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and see, the example that I would have given mom being around was Brave.
Oh, yes, yeah. Who is also going through a Maiden's method herself. Has to go through becoming very different than she typically was. Embracing the animal side of herself to some degree, but not losing herself to it.
Mama Bear.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, and there's a sort of growth into maturity where her mom takes on the role of the dad in that this is tradition, this is the way. Her mom is the order. This is the way. This is the way. So for Merida to want to be combative and to fight against that is something that still just kind of lends into the chaos. But I think that when the mom has the confrontation with chaos, that's when the witch becomes the feminine threat. You can see that they're all kind of playing into each other's stories in that way. So, and that's something that probably is a pretty big clue for the fairy godmother, is that she's really not threatened. Yeah. She doesn't threaten, nor is she threatened. Nor is she threatened. There's a sort of comfort that she has by being outside of it all to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay. So that's basically the last card that I had set over here is one of my favorite questions, really, when it comes to the fairy godmother. This is just something for storytellers, I think, to hone in on. Is it Chekhov's gun or Dumbo's feather?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Ruby slippers.
Okay.
Is it you had it inside of you all along, and you didn't need is it Dumbo's feather? And this is just something that the fairy godmother is using as a device in order to teach you at a time that you need to learn it? Or is this an element that we are introducing at the beginning of the story that immediately that has to go off in Act 3? Is this Chekhov's gun? Is this important to the narrative? Basically, the question is, does the story need it? Because it depends on, I think, how the fairy godmother uses it.
True. I would say if we want to go specifically for the ruby slippers, that those are probably more in the direction of Chekhov's gun, because Glinda tells her very early on, the power in them must be great or she wouldn't want them so badly. And it's pretty clear that there is power in the ruby slippers. Otherwise, Dorothy wouldn't need to click them together. She would just need to say there's no place like home. Close her eyes and say there's no place like home, and then she'd be home. The fact that she needs to click them together specifically shows that there is power in the slippers themselves as well as power in the maiden herself.
Interesting.
Now, if we can think of other examples of things like the ruby slippers that... the glass slippers in Cinderella. It's interesting that so far in the movie adaptations we've watched, the glass slippers are, when there's magic in the version of Cinderella that you watch, the glass slippers are not made from anything. The carriage is made from something. The horses are made from something. The footmen are made from something. The driver's made from something. The dress is made from the rags. But the glass slippers just are spontaneously created.
Yeah.
And granted, though, I mean, then you have, like, say, in Ever After, the glass slippers were her mother's slippers, and that comes into play in an interesting way. But in any event, that's a power outside the maiden herself, in that way. The glass slippers are the extra, the ruby slippers, the glass slippers, and whatever else is kind of filling that role is kind of like the hero gets a sword so that he can fight evil and chaos. The maiden, I guess, gets shoes so that she can walk the path. And it's probably not always even shoes. It may be any number of different things. It may be a book. It may be. What are some other examples of?
Well, but see, the thing is, you have to ask yourself, what is the power of the heart of the ocean? Why do I keep saying the heart of the ocean? The heart of Te Fiti.
Yeah.
What is the power there? Does she obviously it has some sort of power, but was Moana's healing really what she needed?
She needed Te Fiti needed her heart back, granted, but she also needed someone who would empathize with her first, because it's hard to heal someone if you don't first acknowledge their pain.
To really return their heart, requires something more.
Requires you to admit that the heart was broken.
Right.
Someone to acknowledge that.
Yeah, absolutely, and so there, it's kind of like, I see it as the talisman versus the magic words. Yeah. The one doesn't work without the other. Now, that kind of asks the question, though, of the Chekhov's gun versus the Dumbo's feather, because if in let's say in the sense of Dumbo, this is something that he just gets to lay behind once he has the confidence to go off and fly himself.
Yeah.
But if you were to emphasize that as a certain point, no, you need it. Oh, we don't. Nope, you never needed it. Then just I think basically what I'm trying to get at is that from a storytelling viewpoint, if you don't address that, it's sloppy storytelling.
Yeah, that is true. Well, and I would say in The Wizard of Oz, we get a Dumbo's feather and we get a Chekhov's gun. And the Dumbo's feather is the wizard. She didn't need the wizard.
Interesting.
She never needed the wizard. But the journey toward the wizard was what allowed her to learn what she needed to learn. Dumbo never needed the feather. But having the feather gave him that ability to learn what he needed to learn. Pinocchio doesn't need Jiminy Cricket. Jiminy Cricket is a terrible conscience, quite honestly.
Yeah,
he does not do a very good job.
That's interesting.
He has his own conscience, and when he makes the most moral decision he makes in the whole story, which is, I'm going to go and save my father from the belly of the whale, Jiminy Cricket's trying to talk him out of it. He always had his own conscience. He didn't need an external one.
Interesting. The Golden Snitch.
The Golden Snitch from Harry Potter. Now that's very interesting because it's not just the thing that he needs to catch during the Quidditch match.
Right.
In the 7th book and then in the 7th movie, it turns out to hold the resurrection stone inside, and it's given to him by Dumbledore. And at first, there's the whole thing of, where when the Minister of Magic is there, he says, well, I understand that snitches have some degree of memory depending on, who has touched them before. If you touch it, will it open? And so he touches it with his hand when the minister is there, and it doesn't open. And then once the minister is left, he turns to Hermione and Ron and says, do you remember my first Quidditch game? I caught the snitch in my mouth, and he kisses it, and then it opens. It's he remembers the bond that he had with it. Now, that resurrection stone turns out to be important in a way that's very interesting, because he doesn't actually use it to bring anybody back from the dead per se, but he does use it to talk to people who have passed away, people who he loved. He talks to his parents. He talks to Sirius Black and Remus Lupin and a whole bunch of other people who died. And it's while he's on his way to face his death at the hands of Voldemort. So, I don't know. I think that's a Chekhov's gun in that case.
See, and it is basically what I'm getting at here is that there's something interesting for the Golden Snitch, particularly. Why didn't it release the stone? Like, why should it gain a memory?
Yeah, that's an interesting
question.
Why
should it open for him? There's like this sort of ethereal nature even to that in itself, that the magic that it encompasses is again for a time and a period, and there's
which is a lot of magic to go into something that's used in a sport.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Are all snitches like that?
Maybe.
Yeah. There's some really good questions in there, but I wanted to go into it because I think it has something to do with a lot of how the fairy godmother works with time, pacing, taking those things that have always been true, only at a time that you can use it. It's there. It works together. At what point did the pumpkin have the power all along, or does it require her spell? Does she need the pumpkin? Those kinds of things, those questions never actually have to be answered in the story, but I think the storyteller, to some degree, has to be willing to explore those questions.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've got 30 minutes, Nico.
To talk about the hero?
Let's talk hero.
Okay. So I think it's interesting. The hero in the Maiden's method, typically, first of all, his journey can be best summed up by the hero's journey, really. It's already explored for the most part, but in most Maiden's method-centric stories, we don't actually get much of his story, because it's the Maiden's story, of course.
Right.
What we do get are typically two particular traits that he must have. He must be charming, and he must be courageous. He doesn't need to be kind, necessarily, although that often helps.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to be wise, although that often helps. He doesn't need to be smart, although that can help. There are all these other great traits that you could put on a hero, but he doesn't really need those. In order for... Or I suppose it's not necessarily that he doesn't need them so much as they're mentioned less often than the charming and courageous. We see a little bit of that even in the Disney Cinderella. I think he is literally called Prince Charming in the credits.
Sure.
Even though he's just called the Prince in the actual movie.
The Prince.
Yeah, but we see him in several scenes where he's riding a horse while dressed in what's clearly a military uniform, which shows the courage side. Prince Philip from Sleeping Beauty.
Definitely courageous.
There's a courageous character.
Eric.
Oh my gosh. He sees Cthulhu rise up out of the waters and drives the ship right into her. He goes
the belly
for
of the
it.
beast.
I hope that in the live action version there's like a heart to heart between him and Triton, where Triton realizes the worth of this young man and decides, yes, okay, I can trust my dear Ariel.
Right.
To
not all humans are bad, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that would make it all the more powerful, and that's not to knock the version of the Little Mermaid that we already have. It's good. It's very good. Of course, it's good. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Yeah, it's not perfect, but it is.
To take it to the next level, I think that would be a very important thing to add to it.
Let's focus on some non-Disney heroes.
Charlie Brown.
Oh,
we just watched the Peanuts movie last night, and the things ultimately that, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen the Peanuts movie, the things really that won the day for him
were his charming, that he was charming and that he was courageous when all is said and done. And the form that his charmingness took was, of course, his kindness, granted in his particular case. But it was when his sister is floundering during the talent show, rather than put on the magic act he had, which was a pretty impressive magic act. Yeah. Instead, he goes and he helps his sister with her act, and the little red-haired girl sees this. He reads War and Peace and finishes the book report himself, and even though it gets destroyed, the little red-haired girl sees this. When it comes time when everyone's honoring him as the smartest kid in the school because he got the perfect score on the test, he comes out and he said, when he realizes it, he says, actually, no, this was Peppermint Patty's test. This wasn't mine. And, we kind of looked at some of the details and realized that actually on the list, Peppermint Patty was rock bottom, was the very last place.
Which means that Charlie
Brown actually got the worst score out of all of them. And then when he goes to try to visit the little redheaded girl at her house and then meets her mom instead, and is told, hey, she's about to get on the bus and go to summer camp, he's running off, and then he stops and turns to the mother and says, by the way, it was a pleasure to meet you, and then continues running.
It's so cute.
Yeah, it's like, this is just a charming young man, really.
Yes, yeah.
You're a good man, Charlie Brown. And he definitely follows more of the hero's journey, I would argue, in that, because he meets the mentor very early on, and I would argue the mentor is Linus. Because Linus always has the answers, wise beyond his years, despite the blanket and everything else. But he refuses that call. Linus tells him, look, this is what you need to do. You need to go up and talk to her. And Charlie Brown just won't do it. He wants to be somebody before he can go and talk to her. And in the end, it's having the courage to go up and ask her, hey, did you decide to be my pen pal because of sympathy or for some other reason? It takes a lot of courage to go up and ask that question to this girl he hasn't really spoken to. He shows courage every step of the way, giving up his chance to impress her with a magic show, giving up his chance to impress her by being smart, reading War and Peace in a weekend. That's tremendous courage, I would argue. And finally going to actually speak to her, which Linus told him he should have done in the first place. Right. These are all acts of courage. It doesn't need to be battle courage.
Right.
But it is definitely courage.
Facing what you're afraid of. Yeah. Well, and so what it leads me to think of then is in the context of the Maiden's method, where for a man to be charming and courageous, you think about the kinds of things that if you are going to encounter the Maiden at any one point along the method, in order to really do so in a winsome way that's not going to cause more damage, is to be able to use those traits and to hone them. That if you are dealing with an abused dog, you have to be both charming and courageous.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the hag aspect. If you are dealing with a delusional someone locked in the midst of their delusion, feeling like they have to make the world.
Someone like in the movie What Dreams May Come. Him going to save her literally from hell after she commits suicide. He has to be courageous because he's literally
he has to go into hell.
And then he has to be charming because she's on guard when he shows up, and so he has to show that he's good. He has to because you can be good and kind without coming off as good and kind. And you can come off as good and kind without actually being kind.
So,
and that's true too.
So yeah. No, that's a great example.
To be charming and courageous in order to save her from the hell she has made for herself.
Well, and we have this idea when it comes to the dragon that you have to slay the dragon. What if you can tame her?
Yeah.
What if that's precisely what she needs? For that one courageous little mouse that goes and pulls the thorn out of the lion's paw.
Yeah.
That to hit the actual mode of tenderness that is needed there, like you could have told a just as powerful story with Maui returning the heart.
Yeah.
Basically, we can put it that way.
Yeah, they could have just made the movie Maui instead of Moana,
Yeah.
and then told an amazing story.
Could've done
But
the
they
same
chose
thing,
to
yeah.
do Moana because
And I'm good with it.
because it's awesome.
Yeah, it's
and
really
because
good.
Disney does admittedly have a little bit of a bent towards mostly telling the stories of the woman when they tell an animated story versus telling the story of a man when it's a live action.
Because they can use the music and the girls like that more, probably.
Yeah.
And there
Although Tarzan's awesome.
Yeah.
The music's a little weird, but Tarzan.
Yeah, exactly. Tarzan's great, and I know those boy movies. Robin Hood the Fox has less music, although the music in that one's great too.
Yeah,
like when we get it, that's right.
And there's another one, courageous and charming. Those are his primary traits. Now,
Totally.
also,
I love
generous is a very big one.
Robin Hood. Yeah.
And kind, those are also in there.
Mm-hmm.
But courageous and charming are the big ones.
Yeah.
And we see those very early on. Him willing to face to actually make furious the sheriff of Nottingham, and then of course, yeah, he does have to run away, indeed. But then we see him charming during his exchange with Little John. I think you're taking too many chances, Rob. Chances? You must be joking. He's got a big arrow sticking through his hat.
Yeah.
And while they're there talking about this and what a close call they've just had, they hear that Prince John is coming through. Okay, let's rob him.
Sure, let's go. Yeah.
We just nearly got killed. Let's go do something else that'll nearly get us killed.
Courageous and charming slips into stupid and
A little bit, yeah.
yeah. Now there is something interesting though. I love the idea of the charming, because that is, I think, a unique something that we tend to overlook.
Yeah.
We act as if that's handsome, and it's not.
No, it's not. It helps, but
Yeah, exactly. Phoebus.
Phoebus, yes.
That's a great one.
Phoebus isn't really even all that good at the beginning of the story.
No, yeah.
But he is definitely courageous and charming, and we see that very early on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, naughty horse, naughty. He's just impossible. I can't take him anywhere.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like, that's funny. You're a good guy.
Yes, yeah.
Well, then it's Sherlock Holmes. Actually, specifically in the show
Interesting.
Sherlock, I would argue is an example of someone who is courageous and charming, but not kind. Not by any means kind, but he is definitely courageous and charming. And I would argue even John Watson to a certain degree, because while John Watson is kinder than Sherlock, he's definitely got a temper on him,
Yeah.
and Sherlock sets him off a lot of times.
I have one that you're gonna like.
Yeah?
Hup.
Courageous and charming,
Courageous
and
and
kind,
charming,
and all
yeah.
kinds of great things.
He's just
Hup
lovely.
from the Dark Crystal.
He's lovely, yes. Now, okay, so we have talked about, I mean, not here, of course, but, in general, that the timing is important in the Maiden's method. Bottom line, it just is. It's chemistry, and it's kind of like, I've said that it's like a stew. You can have beef, potatoes, broth, all hooked up there in the pot. But if it hasn't been cooking for an hour or longer, no one wants to eat it. You're not going to eat raw beef, potatoes, and cold, it just doesn't work. Just because you have all of the ingredients doesn't mean it's ready. You need time. You need heat. You need these elements to work together. So when we talk about like the help coming at the wrong time, help that comes not really being help, can we talk about maybe some examples of a hero when he's less than courageous, less than charming, and how he might interrupt the maiden in that way and maybe cause some problems for her?
Well, trying to think of examples of heroes who aren't courageous or aren't charming. I can think of one who's courageous but not charming, and that's the Hound from Game of Thrones. I mean, yeah, that's a man with a lot of courage until there's fire involved. But, I mean, there's something to be
give him a little bit of a break on that.
Yeah, that's a pretty severe trauma. But his rescue of Sansa when she's being attacked during the riot, it's like, that's a tremendously courageous moment, but it is not charming. I mean, we see him disembowel the guy, and there's blood and guts, and there's nothing at all charming. And he's
terrifying through and through, and he never tries to be anything less.
And there's a hint that he could be charming when he picks her up and he says, "You're all right, little bird, you're all right." It's there, but he hasn't honed it because he hasn't had to. He's had to be terrifying because he's had to be a villain.
See, now we might play that into the fact, though, that he is not Sansa's hero. At times he is, but in the grander scheme of her story, he is not her hero.
Yeah.
So that kind of plays into where we want to see the truth of the courageous and charm, where I think as in a fullness of man, you'd like to see both of those things come out. I mean, where yes, you want to see the hero overcome the beasts, but sometimes you want to see him do that with wit. And brevity and wisdom, that it's kind of like the samurai. Yeah, you learn swordplay, but you also learn calligraphy.
Yeah.
Like, we want to see you. Yeah, we want go. We want to see you hone these other skills of knowledge and patience, and that's what charm is.
Well, another one who's courageous but not charming, at least at first, is the Beast. From Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah. No.
Fighting the pack of wolves for her. It's like, he proved he was definitely not charming, and she even says it shortly afterwards in the song. True that he's no Prince Charming, but there's something in him I simply didn't see.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that he can be selfless.
Yeah.
When it really matters. And then he becomes charming over time.
And by the end of that song, he's adorable.
Yeah, and then they pick up the bowls and they're drinking them together. And they're both very charming in that whole sequence. But trying to think of an example of a hero who's charming but not courageous.
I was thinking the same thing.
That's a little more difficult. I mean, I guess you could say the guys in The Road to El Dorado, but I would barely call them heroes. They're both very charming. They are not courageous at all. They're running away from everything all the time. They scream like little girls when they see the giant statue, which, granted, I mean, anyone would scream seeing that. But they very specifically scream like little girls, and that's the point, is to show that they are not courageous.
I would give you, this is going to be a weird example, Rugrats.
Okay.
Chucky is very charming, but not courageous.
Interesting.
Phil is very courageous, but not charming. Tommy is both.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
So you kind of have this fulfilled in the boys, where you're seeing these different levels of, Phil will gladly go after anything, and he is not charming at all.
And I could see, in each episode, I do think that Lil is in anyway. I do think she goes through some degree of the Maiden's method.
Maybe
I think we could analyze each episode for that, whereas
Angelica being a feminine threat.
Yeah, what is she? She's
the
hag?
devil.
She's the devil. Yes, she's a totally new form of feminine threat. Just Satan.
We have found a new archetype in Angelica Pickles.
I do think, though, that she is a hag, really.
Yeah.
She's just causing misery because she enjoys watching people suffer.
Feeding off of others. Yeah, she's just feeding off of her parents, very base-natured.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a hag.
She's the worst.
That'll be a fun analysis video. Angelica Pickles, the hag.
Yeah. A lot of the characters in Hey Arnold, I would argue, are very charming but not courageous. I would say Sid. To a certain degree, Gerald. But Arnold, who is the hero,
is both.
Definitely both. He's basically a saint.
Yeah, Arnold is
he really is. Yeah.
glowing. Doug Funny is not very courageous. In his imagination, he is when he's Quail Man, or what's the super what's the spy's name?
I can't
remember either. But they're like in his fantasies, he's courageous. He wants to
be courageous. And, something he's striving for. And I would argue that in most of his plots, when it finally comes time where he has to make a decision, he will still make the courageous choice. It's not the natural choice for him, but he, even just the episode where his grandmother visits and she, gets him to ride the motorcycle with him. She gets him to try sushi, and finally she says, "Oh, go tell Patty she looks nice today." And he has all his anxieties about what this could mean, to tell her this and how she might take it the wrong way and all these things. But when push comes to shove, he goes over and he does it. And she feels great about it.
Right.
When it comes time for him to fight the one kid from the video club or whatever, he does the courageous thing and makes it look like they fought. Mm-hmm. Rather than outing him as a coward. And it takes a lot of courage to try to come up with a solution like that, something that'll help both him and Doug himself.
Yeah, and it is. I think you can kind of find that in these ensemble kids shows from the 90s. Yeah. You see it in Recess.
Yeah. But even let's look at some older stories too.
Okay.
I would say King Arthur is definitely an example of courageous and charming. Lancelot too, but he's far more courageous than he is charming.
Yeah.
To the point of being reckless, and he's another example of a hero who's courageous and charming, but not necessarily virtuous.
Romeo,
yes.
Charming, but not very courageous. Well, no, he's courageous. He
is when it matters.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair.
At first, he's not, but then when things happen, like when Mercutio gets killed, he steps up and does something about it. Mm-hmm. He does not let Tybalt get away with this. Right. Especially since it was essentially murder. Granted, they both had swords out and they were dueling, but Romeo was trying to break up the fight, and it was under his arm that Tybalt stabbed Mercutio. And even that's a courageous act, to step in between two men who have got swords drawn and hold them, especially when one of them already wants to kill him.
Yes.
Tybalt could have just as easily stabbed Romeo.
Exactly, and you better hope you're charming in that moment. And yes, absolutely. Don Quixote definitely is a really strong example of both, and I think that in a lot of the male villains we see where there might be a lot of charm and not a lot of courage.
The first one that came to mind, a lot of charm and no courage, was, of all things, Professor Ratigan from the Great Mouse Detective.
Ratigan?
Very charming.
Oh, Ratigan.
No courage. He's
a blithering
he's a
fool.
rat.
Yeah, no, yeah, he is. Yeah.
You have Moriarty in Sherlock, who takes the easy way out rather than accept defeat.
Right.
That's a coward's thing to do. Mm-hmm. Suicide is the coward's way out. Everyone knows that. And
and there is a lot to be said for those that are not willing to face the challenges that are up against them, and where that can lead you. And there is charm has a certain ploy when it comes to that, to try and talk yourself out of a situation or to work that out.
Yeah. I would say in Star Wars, in the first Star Wars movie, we get an example of two villains who are both lacking one of the two traits of the hero. In Darth Vader, we have courage but no charm. And in the Grand Moff Tarkin, we have charm but no courage. Everything's always, you may fire when ready, take her away. It's always, you take care of this.
Leave it to the minions.
Yeah, leave it to the minions. He doesn't really he doesn't really do anything himself, whereas Vader is definitely hands-on, but there's nothing charming about Vader. You know, he's pretty straightforward about the kind of individual he is and what he's up to. And granted, he deceives Lando in Empire Strikes Back, but it's more of an intimidating deception, where Lando's willing to believe him because he's more afraid of what will happen if he doesn't choose to believe him. You know.
Yeah.
And I would argue Batman in an interesting way. Batman himself is courageous but not terribly charming, but Bruce Wayne is very charming. And that's how he still remains a hero.
I think probably some really fun ones where you see the more courage than charm is probably with the awkward teen. Where you're gonna run into Mike in Stranger Things.
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man's a good one.
Who as Peter Parker is
Mikey in the Goonies.
Yes,
you get this where the adventure and that goes into it, but there's still dweebs. There's like the charm is there is like, oh, look at how you're trying to be charming. Like, you know, oh, you're adorable. Like, but
well, but then he has his speech that is a very charming speech about they've had their time up there. Now it's our time down here. It's our time to be heroes.
Yeah, well, did the Goonies never say die? I'm not a Goonie. You know, like that's there's
why Mouth is not a hero, because Mouth he has plenty of courage but no charm.
Well, and it's also why the older brother gets the girl.
Yeah, because he definitely has both.
Yeah, because let's face it, he's the one who actually wins out in all of that, and frankly, why I think Phoebus wins out over Quasimodo, because while Quasimodo has both,
he doesn't have them as much.
Yeah, exactly. There is kind of like this winning out when it comes to getting the girl, and I think that like, okay, we might as well just close out in our last few minutes here to say this, in the sense of where the Maiden is. And where the hero's going to come in along the way. We don't see a lot of stories where they're together the whole time. But when we see them encounter one another, there's this sort of power there that if we're going to go way back to the really, really basic fairy tale story, that for her to them, you know, this love at first sight, they see each other, they know each other, they have this short interaction, and it's this like lightning kind of, you know, where you can see in an instant courage and charm. Now that's something that is not easy for a man to cultivate, and a girl can't really explain why she sees that either. But there's like, again, it's always worth it for the sake of storytelling. But we can always come back to this, where even just in real life, there's something to be learned here. I hope maybe we had some fatherly examples at the beginning, but for those guys, when you're going after the girl, make her believe that you had to overcome something to go after her. Make her believe that you did so by wanting to enchant her and to win her over. Charm and courage have lots to do with that winning her over. What else is there? Not a lot of charm.
He has to learn that the hard way.
And that's the thing, is that when you have this instance in which you can present the ability to, I can win you from those who would steal you, and I can win you from yourself who would otherwise say, sorry, it's not that simple. You know, any girl doesn't want to be overtaken and, you know, doesn't want to feel like defeated by the guy, but does want to feel that for any misgiving that I would have in my heart against you, tell me why, charm me, show me win me over, why that's invalid, why it's not something that is going to stand in the way. And if that's the magic spell on my brain that keeps me from being with you, break it.
Be courageous, be charming. And courage doesn't always mean recklessness. I mean,
Right.
sure it can, but more often than not, it does not mean recklessness.
And in the simplest terms, it's go talk to her and be sweet, Charlie Brown.
Yeah.
You know that it is. You can be courageous in other ways, and you can be charming in other ways, and she'll see it.
Doesn't need to be battle, doesn't mean you need to climb mountains. Just need to have the courage to do the right thing when times are hard.
Meet the challenge that you have ahead of you, and do it for you, do it for her, and she'll notice.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a great place to stop. We didn't get to our audience question, but I think we could spend a whole other 2 hours on that one. So
Probably.
we will. We might as well tease it. Maybe next time we'll come back. The question was, what makes a strong female character, and how to do so, basically,
Without making her masculine.
the Maiden's method versus just making her act like one of the boys, because it's not the same thing. So, hope you enjoyed it. Hope you guys join us next time.
Bye.
Bye.